What's up?
Hello,
Hey,
thank you for joining us.
I actually don't need to wear this, but I just walked in.
I liked it for the aesthetics of the moment.
It was a vibe.
Okay, maybe we can start like 5:05, just wait for a few more people to roll in.
Yeah, no problem.
Also, thanks everyone for joining us. Feel free to turn your video on if you're comfortable, just so we can make this as much of an interactive experience as we can. Also totally okay if you just woke up like me and you don't want to turn it on. Again, we're going to start around 5:05.
Hi all.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh yeah, sorry for being a couple late. We just came from a different meeting.
Oh, no worries at all. I was just saying that we should probably start like 5:05 maybe, just to wait and see if a few more people want to join in.
Perfect. I'm going to run and grab my phone charger, so I'll be right back.
Sherry's is a company that makes a great shaving experience, quality, durable blades at a fair price.
Hi, yeah, we're gonna get started in just like a minute or so. We're just waiting for a couple more people to join in. Also, again, if you're comfortable, feel free to turn your video on just so we can make this seem and feel more like a conversation. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, totally fine. Cool.
Dale! Oh my gosh. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Dale was my student.
I know. I saw your name when I looked this up, and I was so excited.
Hi, Dale.
Hi.
And thanks everyone for turning your videos on. I think we can get started now. I'm Vanessa. I'm a junior at Yale, and I am a center staffer at the Asian American Cultural Center in the Civic and Political Engagement team. And we're so excited and thankful to welcome the members of the Asian American Feminist Collective today to come and talk a little bit about their organizing, both in general and also during these times of COVID. And so I'll hand it over to y'all. Saloni, maybe if you want to jump into introductions.
Sure. So we thought we could kind of start with our introductions, but we wanted to also just flag that we would love if you all shared who you were, as we get a little later on in the conversation, just to kind of give you time to emotionally prepare to speak in case you hadn't planned on doing that. But I can start off. I'm Saloni. I'm one of the co-leaders of AAFC. In my non-AAFC life, I'm a PhD candidate at Yale, where I'm in the history department. And I work on 20th century US history, and my dissertation project is about the first decades of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I'll keep it brief just so we all get a chance to talk, but I'll pass it on to Senti.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's really nice to see all of your faces. My name is Senti Sojwal. My pronouns are she and her. I'm also a co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective. In my civilian life, I'm the brand and marketing manager at Planned Parenthood of Greater New York. I'm a native New Yorker, and I'm 3 weeks away from finishing my master's program at NYU, where I'm doing my master's in public health. So I will pass it on to Tiffany.
Hi, Tiffany, she, her pronouns as well. I'm a co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective also. And in my civilian life, which I like that, I am a journalist, currently an editor at Rewire News, which covers issues of sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. And in my writing, I do write a lot about Asian American issues, identity, politics, etc. And I will pass it on to the last one, Rachel.
Hi all, so nice to see you and meet you. I'm Rachel, I use she, her pronouns. I'm with AFC. In my other life, I am getting my PhD in media culture and communication. So I work at the intersection of digital technology, solidarity, and racial justice movements. And I guess in my other life, I also like to do graphic design projects and work in different social movement spaces. So I guess I will stop there and pass it back to. Great. So I actually have a little bit of we have a little schedule planned out. And so I think we're going to pass it to Senti next. He'll talk a little bit about kind of how AAFC got started, our origin story, et cetera. So I'm actually going to repass it to Senti.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can share a little bit about how we came to be and sort of what our political priorities are, the kinds of work that we're engaged in now. We really came together sort of informally right after the 2016 election. I should also add that our collective leadership also includes one more member, Julie Kim, who couldn't be here today, but she says hi, and she works at the New York City Census as the Queensborough lead. So she's doing a lot of amazing work. So we really were sort of seeing, I think, as I'm sure a lot of you were, like a sort of big swell of feminist activism that happened right after the election. So we're seeing stuff like the Women's March. We're seeing a lot of conversations about how Donald Trump's election really hurts the feminist movement, really hurts women, and really hurts a lot of people who hold different marginalized identities. And so within sort of seeing this groundswell of activism, we felt like we were also seeing a lot of erasure of our communities represented in a lot of that discourse and in that political activism. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of pussy hats, we're seeing a lot of white women being centered in the movement, and we didn't really feel like we were seeing as much of our voices and struggles as people of color, as immigrants, really represented in a lot of those conversations. And so we started just sort of really informally gathering and doing some collaborations with different institutions around New York City to just talk about stuff like Asian American feminism in the age of Trump, to host conversations about different feminist activism that was happening, that was actually community-based, that we were seeing around us. And so after a few months of doing these kinds of gatherings more informally, we were just seeing that there was such a huge response, which really showed us that there was a real need to sort of formalize our collective and the work that we were doing, because there was a real hunger for it. And there were also so much of these conversations happening like in disparate ways across institutions and grassroots organizations and activist communities in New York. And so we really wanted to kind of formalize our structure. And so about a year after that, we launched formally as a political collective. And you can read more about sort of the different kinds of work that we've done on our website, which we can definitely link here. But you know, we really sort of consider ourselves as engaging in intersectional feminist politics that's grounded within our Asian American communities. So to us, that means people whose backgrounds encompass East, Southeast, South Asian, Pacific Islander, multi-ethnic, diasporic Asian identities. And through public events and resources, which is primarily what we do, we seek to really create spaces for identity exploration, political education, and community building and advocacy. I think that for the five of us, we had really sort of felt like this kind of space had been really lacking for us politically, within feminist discourse. And also, I think just in a larger way, like in sort of friendship, like in being able to create spaces like this where you can talk about how all these different issues intersect with our identities. And so the kinds of events that we do have been, you know, all kinds of stuff from like panels and workshops about Asian American history and organizing happening in New York City, to collaborations with museums and other cultural institutions. We just released our latest zine, which Rachel really was like the genius behind, which is all about what our communities are going through right now with COVID-19. And so, yeah, we really just want to bring people together and create space to have conversations about how feminism and politics intersect with our lives and our identities, and build bridges for people to be able to connect on those issues.
So yeah, I think that we would love to kind of open up this prompt, because so much of our work has really been about, I was just in another meeting with Julie where she used this phrase, so I'll cite her, but kind of creating a feminist public for the people that we interact with, for our communities, and to make space for kind of the conversations that we don't see happening elsewhere. So if you've had a chance to look at the zine, you know that a lot of it is kind of our work made manifest, but also a lot of our kind of community organizations that we've worked with, people whose work we respect and admire, kind of laying out a vision for how they think you would respond to a crisis like this with care rather than with a language of emergency or kind of state neglect. So I kind of wanted to open up a little bit of a prompt here and ask if anyone would be willing to share what Asian American feminism means to them, where their kind of Asian American identity might actually intersect with a feminist identity, if that was sort of prevalent as you decided to come to this event, why you are interested, just so we know have a sense of who's in the room and how you all are thinking of all of this. And I guess we can take stack in the comments if that's the easiest way to do it. You can just kind of say stack, or you can raise your hand. I'm still a Zoom class like novice.
So I guess just to kick off,
Um, I guess for me, the tension that I've had to sort of grapple with over the years is that in a lot of conservative Asian populations, feminism is often coded as a foreign idea, or more specifically, a Western idea. And so finding ways to sort of deal with those perceptions and yeah, like the times in which there is a bit of a tension between our different identities and explaining that to other people who might not understand it the same way.
I'll also add on to that and say that Asian American feminism is kind of representing like Asian American voices in this issue, but also focusing on like intersectionalities between different groups. And I know that recently, I don't do y'all say AAFC or do you have like a different abbreviation slash shorthand? Okay.
AAFC is good.
Okay, so I know that AAFC recently had like an Instagram event with I think like Black feminists. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I just thought that that was really really important as well because there are a lot of different groups, you know, who want to. Oh, it hasn't happened yet. Oh, okay, okay. So yeah, I saw the promos for that, but I just thought that that brings to light a really important issue during this time as well because I think that all of these the tensions between like Asian communities and Black communities are becoming, I think, exacerbated right now. And I love the ways that AFC has been trying to bring together the two, and to try to like kind of explore those tensions, but also find ways to like uplift everybody.
Yeah, in both of your comments, I'm hearing a lot of kind of where history has been useful for us in the past, just because there's been so much solidarity and coalition building between those kinds of feminist communities. And we also do a kind of version of this. It's a history workshop where we talk a lot about kind of how radical non-Western feminist movements have been, and have given us kind of quite a lot of ground to build off of and learn from, but it's often not foregrounded in our kind of internal community conversations. I'm going to step back and let's see if anyone else has stuff that they want to add to. Going once, going twice. All right, perhaps we'll skip ahead then, and then we can see if any of you might be more kind of willing to share as we move forward. And I highly recommend if you have like a pen or paper, it's kind of a nice self-reflective exercise, and there are no wrong answers here. It's kind of a vulnerable space that we all occupy as we come to different kinds of activism. What conversations you wish you saw in your own feminist spaces or your Asian American spaces? I think sometimes bridging that gap is where we really found something fruitful for us, in figuring out the conversations that were not being had in many of the movement spaces that we were in. And I know for some folks that could mean, you know, it's finding queer community in Asian American spaces. That didn't exist for a long time, or not knowing where to find those things. So we'll table it. I'm going to kind of introduce Rachel a little bit, but please do journal if you don't mind while we talk, because this is so much more meaningful and I think kind of rich if we all think through it together.
Thanks, Saloni, and thanks for those who shared. I do think that question, right, like what does Asian American feminism mean to you? It is a really big question. And I think for me and for those of us at AAFC, right, like that's something that we continue to grow and evolve in, right? Like some of the language that we really use when we talk about what is Asian American feminism to us, we talk about it as this ever evolving practice, right? Like, so the kinds of knowledges, experiences that we bring to it, like they continue to change as the things that we learn together continue to change. And so what I'll speak a little bit about is our zine projects, and also a little bit about our coalition building practices, which we can dive more into both the media making and coalition building piece in the Q&A. But our first zine really was about this question, like, what is Asian American feminism, right? And like wanting to define some of the principles of practice, and something that like we've been continuing to grow in as we have been thinking about, like, how do we, like, how have we started as a collective, and how are we sustaining ourselves as a collective, really looking to history, right? Like where organizations, they begin by laying out their political principles, their values, like what are their commitments? Like who do they feel accountable to, responsible for, and how can we center our work around those commitments? And that was kind of the ethos of the first zine. And I think where we've also now shifted, right, is this question of how we sustain ourselves, which I think is very much brought to the fore during the pandemic, right? Like how do we sustain? We don't burn out, we're not exhausted. And so this kind of like maintenance of sustaining ourselves and each other, which I think the coalition building work really expands upon, right? Like kind of knowing that we can't do this work alone, that we do this work in friendship, like through intentional relationship building, and that a lot of political work happens like at somebody's potluck in somebody's house, right? Like in these kinds of moments of hanging out and being together. And so kind of thinking about just the zine and the media making, just some thoughts that like I've been thinking about in terms of collaborative work, and I'm sure in your organization, this might also be something that has been provocative for you, but I've just been thinking a lot too, right, that we often think about movement work and what's recorded as the kind of like big outputs, right? Like, so like the media, the big speeches, the big rallies. So like how many people come, like what is this like final object that gets produced? But often, right, like the process of movement building is like kind of disappears with that. So how people stay up late, like trying to talk to each other, the kind of note taking, right? Like the administrative labor that's often very feminized, like that really disappears. But I feel like in those slow acts of building together is how movements sustain themselves, right? And so it's like who, like the person, like Vanessa, like kind of going back and forth, like coordinating this meeting, like with us, right? Like that kind of labor, like to get people into shared space and shared time together is again, like, right, like these kind of movement acts of producing a feel of togetherness. So I think that's just something that I also wanted to offer in terms of our zines, like the kind of back end of that work is like doing a lot of thinking together on Google Docs and this act of like being with others to think and to feel and to dream. And I think in our most recent zine, we bring in Kai Chen Tom, and they're writing about the politics of love. And something that really has resonated with me in their writing has been about a politics of indispensability, right? Like, so Kai really writes about revolutionary politics as this relationship that requires mutual responsibility and processes of rupture and repair. And so how this kind of co-building together really fosters the kind of bonds that like invest in each other's growth, which I think the kind of content and this idea of like care in the time of coronavirus and community resiliency really thinks to. And I think often both in academic spaces, so as students, and then also, right, like in whatever future work that you do, often we're only recognized for our individual merits and efforts, but there's really something beautiful and I think really important of how we think about how we work collaboratively and collectively. So those are just some of my provocations on that collaborative work, like behind the zine and some of the ethos behind it. But I think that opens a lot of things up. I know you all had so many beautiful questions for us, so maybe we can pass it to kind of start thinking through some of those to really address the things that are on your minds.
Yeah, sorry. Does anyone else have anything to say about collaborative work? No? Thoughts? Okay, I'm gonna pass to Tiff, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Vanessa, thanks for, taking the time to put this together and for sending us that list of questions that y'all sent over. I'm guessing that was a collaborative effort, or maybe they're all yours. But I was wondering, would it be helpful if I started going through some of the ones that we pulled from there? Okay, cool. And, as we share our perspectives, of course, we would love to hear some of y'all's if you have some thoughts percolating. As when Rachel talks, or Professor Quo, as I'm calling her now, she makes my brain tingle. So hopefully some of y'all kind of like come away with some of these conversations with some more to talk about. But one of the first questions that we got, which is one of my favorites, is I am unlearning and relearning about aspects of my Asian American identity every day. How can I keep myself accountable for developing my own identity in conversation with broader identity politics? Yeah, that's a really great question and a really deep one, and we could probably honestly talk about it for an entire hour. But given the scope of time, I think that one of the great things that you're doing right now is being in conversation and asking questions and even questioning that. Like the fact that you even know that you're unlearning something is already like a really positive step, obviously, because if you're unaware of that, then you're not able to decide where it is that you fit into these like broader topics. So constantly, obviously, questioning things like power and privilege. How are we in coalition with other groups? How am I engaging even with my coworker or my like peers sometimes? That kind of thing is really important. As for me personally, one of the tools that I've found very helpful, because I'm a journalist, is just kind of like researching, so doing like the reading, and if I'm wanting to learn something about like Black feminism, just going straight to the source. And so whenever I was thinking about unpacking and unlearning a lot of my own internalized issues around, say, like body size, around like colorism and race, and even around like sexuality and gender and stuff. Sonia Renee Taylor's book, The Body Is Not an Apology, was a really great resource, because it's not just about like the body positivity movement and about like fat phobia and body shame, but it also definitely like creates this larger framework, where she is using like radical empathy, and making sure that it's constant, like she's constantly using this like intersectional feminist framework, honestly, and lens, whenever like coming across issues of of like body image, or like how these like larger systems or whatever come into play to oppress like different types of bodies, and mostly, of course, Black and disabled and like queer bodies specifically. And so yeah, I definitely strongly suggest that, just doing reading and constantly doing that internal digging. And if you have the resources, obviously, speaking to people like a therapist perhaps who is culturally sensitive, and yeah, just constantly having like conversations about it in different spaces and with different types of people, and not putting yourself in an echo chamber where while we know that yeah, cool, like Asian American politics, like yay feminism, yay like progressivism or whatever, but then also still like challenging yourself to like go outside of those spheres a little bit. And I'm not talking about like talking to racist Trump supporters or anything like that, but just people in different organizing spaces, don't come into spaces assuming that you know everything, and that just because you have done the work that you're already like there. There's always more to learn, and always like yeah, just I feel like more to kind of like develop and grow. And so yeah, just starting by asking those questions is great. And also, by the way, if y'all end up having other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
And Tiff, would you mind if I just kind of added on to that a little bit? I loved a lot of what you had to say, and I also think that part of the accountability piece of that question is having a community that can call you in, and really cultivating that and taking time to build trust with people. It can be really hard to hear that you have hurt someone or offended someone, or perhaps not been the most thoughtful you could be. But the only way we actually learn is if we're able to have those challenging conversations. And I think actually creating a space where you're not questioning someone's motivations and calling you in or kind of pushing you forward. I know one of the more rewarding parts of being part of this group and this collective for me has been that we often have conversations about what our values are and what kinds of things we want to do, and if we have time or space for something. And I think those are actually fairly deep conversations that you can have if you trust the people you're having them with. So as you kind of go forward into your lives and want to be accountable to however many people you want to be accountable to, really having relationships where that feels like it's on the table, that people can actually challenge you on things.
That's great. I'm going to move into another question. Okay, so let's see. I'm curious about AAFC's mobilization of digital resources and platforms to create their community, and what they feel are some of the lessons that they've learned through this method of organizing. This sounds very much like a Rachel question.
I'm so excited to talk about this question, and happy to talk about whoever asked it if they want to follow up, just to chat about digital politics. But when I saw this question, one of the things that I was really thinking through, right, is that the ways that we've used digital platforms, we use them differently for different things, right? Like, so Saloni was talking about the importance of building trust and having conversations of accountability, right? Twitter is not a place for that, right? Like, you're not going to have like these high stakes conversations to like really engage conflict in a space like Twitter. And I think something that we've also really learned, right, is that some of the values that are embedded in different platforms, right? Like that they're about speed, they're about scale, they're about like kind of getting people to follow the feed, isn't necessarily, right, like designed to engage conflict or to engage really the pace of movement building. And so to kind of back up, where AAFC first started, like before, when we first imagined ourselves as a collective, we weren't really thinking that it was just going to be a small core of people, right? Like the kind of first way that we thought about in this kind of logic of like, oh, we want to build a feminist movement was really about, we want to think about scale and how many people we can bring in. And we were thinking about using Slack as this digital infrastructure to do that work. But I think one of the things that we really also found is that in relation to the kind of uses of like these different digital infrastructures, it's really hard to think about how do you hold space intentionally for multiple people to plug in. And that's what we actually needed to do to like both define and practice our politics, was to think about like that we could do this work really deeply with 5 people, to like have difficult conversations with one another in ways that may be more difficult to do in a different platform, right? And so we've just also been thinking about and learning a lot, like what are the kinds of different resources, digital resources that we can use and for what. And so we recently just had a tweet chat and learning, right, like that hashtags are good modes of things to use when we want to index and archive like aspects of our feminist practices online, right? Like that is an act of like archiving. But again, that when we bring in people, it's not that we're really engaging difficult conversations about like what feminist practice like is meaning to us. It's kind of a place to carve out and build that public, and for other people to access that as a resource and to read and to learn together. Also learning, like Instagram has been something that we've been used a lot, but right, like Instagram as this kind of value of like visibility and representation, and sometimes, right, like movement work doesn't always have to be so public facing. And so I think like that's a kind of learned moment. But I think a lot of what we're trying to do is think about how different digital formats, what they afford us, and being able to kind of like be able to like bring our feminist politics forward. And so some of them allow for certain things, some of them don't. And I do want to signal boost before I pass it, the work of one of our close like partners, which is Equality Labs. And if someone can drop their link in there, but they're a South Asian Dalit feminist-based organization that really got started doing digital security work. And they've been recently kind of like doing a lot of their campaigning about how do we make digital spaces safer, because corporations, right, like aren't holding people accountable to hate speech, and they end up becoming these like feedback loops and really toxic environments. So just wanted to boost that as like a organization that we really look to. And I do, I kind of tend to be grumpier about digital media, but I just also want to share, like Senti has taught me a lot about the pleasure and joys of social media and like how to use that as like spaces of joy and feminist humor, which I'm kind of more of a grump about. So if I also want to give you the option too of like saying some things, right, about like digital media practices as spaces for feminist joy.
Yeah, I think that as much as the internet is a place of pure trash, I think it's also a place where I learn so much, I laugh so much. I think that I have really actually borrowed this book from Rachel, but when I read Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown last year, we can drop that in the notes too. She really like does a lot of work around like centering the pursuit of pleasure in our lives as a radical act. And she doesn't mean just sexual pleasure. Like she really means like centering joy in your life when we live in a capitalist society that values us for our labor and our output. What does it mean to actually create an existence and create communities where we actually center and think about not just our right to survive, but our right to live with joy, our right to live like whole, complete lives where pleasure, happiness, joy, connection are centered. And I think that that really sort of taught me again that self-care is a term that's been so co-opted by like mainstream white wellness culture. It's like smoothies and face masks, but that's not what self-care actually means. Like self-care actually means creating communities and societies where all of us are able to live with opportunity and dignity and joy. Tiff, do you want me to just go into the next question since I think I'm up for it?
Oh, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, what I was gonna answer too.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. The next question. What is something that surprised? I think everyone probably has something to say about this. What is something that has surprised you about organizing? For me, it's that the people who are in charge, you know, have risen to the top, or even sometimes have like founded the organization or been, you know, like leaders of the movement, are not always the people who know the most about anything, or have the best politics even. And that, yeah, I mean, I personally think that I find a lot more like comrades or whatever among the people who are like working on the ground and stuff. And then whenever it gets like higher up and whenever it comes to like glamour activism or whatever, it's a lot harder to find a common ground with people. Yeah, sorry, Senti, what's your thing?
Oh, I just wanted to, does anybody else want to answer the question about organizing? I'm sure.
Well, this is almost, it kind of dovetails on Senti and Rachel, but working with Senti and Rachel, who both kind of think about digital movement spaces and digital platforms for a living and as their work, has really taught me how much work goes into creating engagement or producing a successful event or any of those things. And the amount of care and thought put into something like a tweet chat, which seems like, you know, you have a hashtag and then it goes viral, is actually quite a bit of that kind of behind the scenes Google Doc making, note making, run of show writing stuff. And so I think that's both surprised me and made me rather like hopeful about how much there is to do if we really start kind of like putting that invisible labor at the forefront of how we actually build a movement. Yeah, I have so much more to say, but I'm going to pass it.
To me?
Yeah, to you, Senti. Sorry.
Yeah, one thing I guess I will say about organizing work, something that I think I sort of knew acutely, like when I was a baby activist, but I know now very profoundly, especially working at a very prominent white feminist institution is that like everything progressive and real and important that has ever happened in any organizing space probably happened because of a woman of color. And so I really feel like we have so consistently, so constantly been the people who really propel movements forward. And I feel like I see that in my work every day. And I think living the sort of tension between doing professional activism and the activism that I feel like I'm able to do with AAFC are so polar opposite in terms of philosophy, in terms of the way we think about our relationships. And I think just has really taught me that like the revolution will never come from a nonprofit, and it will never come from like anything corporate. And so I feel like that's a very hard sort of balance to hold, but I think it's just something that we're learning more about constantly. So I can go into the next question, and I would also love anybody else to chime in. But the question is how, sorry, I can't see this because someone's right in front of it, but how can Asian American organizers work on building solidarity with other POC groups? So Tiff touched on this a little bit, but I have actually been thinking about solidarity a lot today because I was preparing for our conversation with Black women radicals on Thursday. And so I was just sort of thinking a lot about what solidarity means in practice, not just words, because I think that is a word that is thrown around a lot. And I think is something that, you know, like a lot of activist ideals that really came from a radical place has also been something that's sort of been co-opted by mainstream movements. And so like the history of just solidarity as an idea is that like in traditional Marxist theory, it was really about solidarity among the working class. And it was really about saying that all of our struggles are entwined, and it's only through unity and working together that we are going to acquire any rights or that we are ever going to move forward in society. And so I think that to me, solidarity really means that it's really about relationships, right? And I think it's about understanding that we don't have to have a personal connection to a person or a struggle to understand that we can take action on behalf of that person or that struggle. And so when I say that solidarity really begins with relationships, I want to also just echo something that Rachel said earlier when she talked about how in a lot of activist work, there's a lot of emphasis placed on like the thing that's glamorous or the thing that gets the most attention, or like, you know, the magazine feature or whatever. But just like in activist work, like how visibility is so important, I think, like, or conceived as so important. I really think that when we think about our relationships, like that's the number one place where we can really build our own personal politics of solidarity. Like when you look to your own Asian American community, like what does it look like? Is it an Asian American community that includes people across socioeconomic backgrounds? Is it multiracial? Is it diverse with regard to religion? Like who are you surrounding yourself with every day? Who do you read? Who do you show up for? Like what are you interested in? And by expanding just who we spend our time around and what we're ingesting, I think like that's the number one way that we really start to build a life where solidarity is centered. And I think even now there's so many opportunities for us to learn more about what other communities are going through and how our issues are aligned. You know, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting all of us, of course, but we also have to examine the ways in which like there are deep, deep racial and socioeconomic disparities amongst how this pandemic is hitting our communities. And we need to both hold the reality that our experiences of this pandemic are not the same, while also saying, you know, there's really no moving forward without collective liberation and understanding that, you know, if we can't do something like cancel rent for everybody who needs it, if we can't have Medicare for all, for every single person who needs healthcare. Like, if we don't actually create political movements where all of our needs are centered, then, you know, what are we doing? So I think that also, like, so much of what the pandemic has really revealed is a lot of what feminist organizers, particularly Black feminist organizers, have been talking about for decades. So, you know, this is a moment that really requires re-examining and centering the critical importance of the meaning of care, which is something that we explore in our zine. Um, and also, like, reimagining what work is essential and whose work has value. Like, it's no secret that communities of color are suffering the most here. Why is that? And what does it mean for us as Asian Americans, who are definitely in some ways seeing the repercussions of this moment resulting in hate crimes for our communities, people being afraid to go outside? We're experiencing that, but also Black communities are experiencing the vast majority of COVID-19 deaths, you know? So what does it mean for us to bring that into our conversations that we have with our communities about anti-Asian racism in this moment? And so I feel really moved by a lot of the progressive organizing that I'm seeing right now from both Black communities and Asian American communities, and being able to amplify the different ways that this moment is intersecting with our identities and hurting our communities in different ways. And I think that there's so many conversations happening right now about what it actually means for us to work together and actually demand things of our government, and protections that can ensure that we can all actually make it out of this with what we need.
Yes, Senti. I also think that all of you have some experience with solidarity already in kind of the movement spaces you've been part of. Just kind of a little insider baseball. The Universal Pass fight at Yale was one where all of you kind of had to come up with some sense of what you were able to do, and then who you're willing to fight for and who you're willing to show up for, even if their struggle might not be the same as your struggle, right? And how you can come up with the most just solution for the most people. I think that being in solidarity with people is speaking up when it's difficult, and understanding that power often organizes us in a way to pit us against each other, whether that's in community, whether that's with other communities, and kind of resisting that logic, this scarcity logic and austerity logic, the sense that there's only so much of a pie, and if we don't scramble fast enough to get it, we'll miss out on it. I think kind of constantly working to push back on that is where I've learned the most about solidarity myself. I know in graduate student organizing, we see it all the time, right? If we'll give 6th and 7th years an extension, but not 1st and 2nd years. If you're kind of in a good place with that, it might be really tempting to jump at this good offer. But where we really build solidarity is showing up for the people who are not being taken care of, in the hopes that then they show up for you later. Not to sound so mercenary about solidarity. There are lots of reasons why you should do it.
I really love this, and I want to just co-sign everything that Senti and Saloni are saying, and I don't have much to add to that, but I think also a lot of times, right, like when people do talk about solidarity, it's this idea of like, okay, we're building across, and I've just been really lucky that in graduate school, I've now talked to like maybe 40 different Asian American organizers on what they think solidarity means, including Senti, who was like my first interview that I like test ran all of my questions on. But something that really has like come up again and again from people was like how we, quote unquote, like if we think of Asian America as the political home, right, that people talk about it as this home, and how we like care for each other, care for this home. It's also this idea of like solidarity as like getting our house in order, right? Like that there's a lot of messy work within like our communities as Asian Americans that we also really have to disentangle to really be able to like work in solidarity with other groups, right? Like there's a lot of like messy internalized stuff that we have to get across. And I think to also echo what Cynthia was saying, right, like that solidarity begins with relationships and who we spend our time with. This idea, right, like that it's not just a one-time thing, but like thinking about where you do spend your time and where you can show up again and again and again, right? Like that it is like a repetitive and iterative act that also evolves and changes. And I think also this idea of like building solidarities across difference, right? Like not just like bringing a ton of different people in just for the sake of different people in the room, but really thinking at both like the macro level and also micro level of like what it means to, like what does that difference mean in terms of power dynamics within a relationship of when someone enters into a space, right? Like what do they need in order to be able to enter into a space? Like how do we consider like our day-to-day practices, like from scheduling a meeting to the platforms that we use to like the political demands at play that really account for those differences in power. So I think those are just my short thoughts on it.
Yeah. So I'm going to move on to the next question so we can get through them all. How do you see intersectional feminism and coalition building happening during COVID-19? What tangible efforts can we, Yale students, be involved in to help? Rachel, I think you might have a response to this one too.
Mine is really short. I think just like boosting something. So I'm going to drop a link, Free Them All for Public Health. For those who haven't seen it, like I would follow, like I just dropped the website and maybe just follow them on Twitter, but they tend to have day-to-day different calls to action. And I think in a really tangible way, what they're trying to do is connect this broader vision of prison abolition and decarceration, but think about in this moment, what does it mean to like demand the release of people who are incarcerated because they're so at risk, like in detention centers and prisons and jails, and thinking about it, right, like across from like we need to stop like policing, we need to stop ICE checks, like we need to like that like level to like we need just people out of jails, like two calls to be like we need to stop jails expansion, we need to close Rikers, and then this broader vision. So I think it's a really great campaign to think about like how intersectionality is at work at the level of a campaign and at policy, and that actually there's like things, right, like that you can do at home, from phone zaps to email alerts. So that's one that I would boost. I think it was Santi earlier that brought up Cancel Rent. CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, many of you may like already know of this organization, but they're doing a lot around housing justice right now. And so they do have a mutual aid fund for tenants in Chinatown for their Cancel Rent campaign. So I guess I'll also boost, they're doing their annual karaoke battle, which is coming up, so it's fun, but also they're raising funds for that as like a rapid response to help like raise rent funds for people who are more at risk because of job loss and can't pay for housing, food, etc. So it's like a mutual aid thing. And then if you have specific tangible skills, right, like that sometimes actually coalition building happens at the level of like what you already do that you can offer. And like tangibly for me, for example, right, like that I can do design work like pretty quickly, and that's how I've plugged into movement spaces. And so like if like thinking about those tangible skills, like if you have language skills, if you're someone who like does like to do deep dives into policy, like those are all things that are tangible that different movements need. And coming into spaces with things like that to offer is like a really helpful way to plug in. And it also like demonstrates ways that like people can trust you, like, and also like be able to build with you. So those are just some short thoughts.
One other thing that I just want to share that, well, Rachel, thank you so much for sharing all those things. Something that I was just thinking a little bit more about today. You know, I think that this moment has really revealed that we are super, super lacking in community-based leadership. We're really lacking in direction and support that our communities need. I know that in New York City, we have city council elections coming up in 2021, and a lot of people who are running for local office right now have had to completely, obviously, stop doing any kind of in-person campaign events, rallies, going out and being able to meet constituents. And so I would say really do some research about where you are locally, whatever city you're in. If there are progressive candidates right now who would otherwise be running elections and being able to meet people, see if you can donate to their campaigns and see if you can do stuff like phone banking or text banking from home, because this is going to be our next generation of leadership that is going to inherit all of this bullshit that we are living through right now. And so, you know, just having a few friends of mine right now who are running for office and really feeling the repercussions of not being able to go out and meet people and create galvanization for their movements, please do some research and find progressive candidates in your area that you can support right now.
I was going to add that one very direct action that people can do is to also contribute to all the different mutual aid funds, and not just ones that are necessarily like in your community, but also ones for Black trans solidarity, for sex workers in New York and across. I mean, there's a mutual aid fund for literally every single different city because of how badly it has impacted that industry and that community. And also, like those within those like mutual aid networks, like let's say, what am I trying to say? The ones that, like, for example, Rachel included in our zine by No New Jails's organizer, I don't remember the last name. But yeah, that where people have really like come together through a coalition and created these different mutual aid like spreadsheets with everything that you might need from domestic violence hotlines to basic like where you can pick up food for free. So just in the way that I've seen our communities kind of come together and do that, that's amazing. And if you can ever like plug into any of those, look into it. Usually they have a lot of information about like how you can also help too within your community, whether it's like grocery drop-offs or just donating money. Since we're getting to the tail end of this time, I wanted to first of all open it up to any questions that y'all might have coming up right now, and as well as this one favorite question, also second favorite question that we have, which is on how you meet other queer Asian Americans in New York City, both now and during the pandemic and generally. One of my favorite partner orgs that we work with is Q-Wave. They are a queer and trans LGBTQ Asian American group, and they honestly, one of my favorite things is that it's like kind of like founded in like Asian like lesbian leadership. So I really appreciate that, since sometimes we all know that queer spaces can often be like gay male spaces. And CGay, if you are Filipino American, is another really great community. CGay I know that they have online little like kind of like not therapy sessions, but just like mental health discussions and stuff. They like support groups, that's what they call it. And Q-Wave also, they do a really great job curating entire like newsletters of events and stuff that they're still doing, or that they're signal boosting because it's somehow like in the like queer Asian and feminist space. And then as on the like fun side, there have been some really amazing things happening on Instagram and on Zoom. Of course, be careful with your Zoom usage and any video that you're in. But Cloud9, which is something that Bufu, which is also based here in Brooklyn, they're an Asian and Black art activism group. I'm sorry if I'm doing a poor job describing them, but they've been doing these like 48-hour dance parties, which is a lot of fun. And then also one of our community members, Olivia has been coordinating these like QT BIPOC speed dating on the cloud events, which is really fun. So yeah, and I think yeah, just doing things like that, plugging into those communities, like finding them and just RSVPing and showing up and stuff. That's always great, and hopefully y'all can stay in touch, and then when we're all allowed to go out again, you can meet them in person, since these are all like New York based groups.
We'll have a party.
Are there any questions in the chat that I'm seeing? Let's see. Nope, no extra. Oh, wait.
I had a quick question. I'm not sure if you were going to mention it later on, but as a New Yorker, like a lot of these issues really do resonate with me, and I was wondering how maybe like some of us could get involved with AAFC, especially this summer.
Yeah, Rachel, do you want to answer?
I was going to say, I think we will probably have more information on that as we have more information on the pandemic. But a thing that we're hosting this summer is with the Allied Media Conference. So we're hosting a feminist like network gathering, and we'll be doing some events around that and structuring and we're trying to right now, like we just got an update that they've moved the conference from June to July, but that like potentially we'll be doing some stuff and building like a broader feminist network in that space. So we can follow up and send a little bit more information around that and just like broader events that will be there. AMC is also a really good place to meet other queer Asians, I would say. So as a conference, it's probably worth checking out. But I think right now we're also just trying to figure out how we'll regroup given the pandemic. But I think we'll share back out to like in terms of like possibilities to contribute to future zines, the digital storytelling platform, when we're able to do events again in person. Like we're always looking for volunteer people to enter into those spaces, like our talk circles. But I think we're still in a moment of kind of figuring out how to get people involved, but when we're all virtual. So more details to come, at least is my answer and pulse on the conversations we've been having.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's 6 o'clock. If anyone else has any last questions, we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, thanks everyone for joining us today, spending an hour with us and being so like inquisitive. I, really look to y'all as, like awesome, badass, like young Asian people because I feel like sometimes, like my personal political awakening wasn't as, I don't know, expedient, I feel like, and everyone kind of is on their own journeys, but I love that y'all are here wanting to talk about and engage in Asian American feminism. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for holding space with us. And I'm clearly speaking from a place of deeply vested interest, but your feminism can live at Yale and your activism can live at Yale, and you can push that institution to do more than it's doing every single day because they are accountable to all of you. They're accountable to the community that they're in. And in my experience, they need to be reminded of that as often as possible.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
Thank
hopefully once we're back on campus, hopefully next year, we'll be able to see some of y'all in the collective in person for any events we might have at the AACC. But yeah, thank you so much again. And to the participants, I have been recording this video and I'm also going to save this chat, so I'll send those out after. But thanks so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.